All right, welcome to another installment of the PracticeBloom podcast, or if you're watching this on video, it could be the podcast video. And so today we want to talk about doing the math. So one of the most important things is to understand your marketing dollars and how they're being spent. It's critical to think through the process of a spend and the criteria around making sure that that's ROI positive or return on investment positive. A lot of the times when we run into practitioners, the issue is about thinking of the marketing expense as an expense that's related to just basically a number. Where if we look at the average lifetime value of a patient and we look at the average lifetime value of the experience that you're going to be delivering and the referrals, there's a much larger number at play. Now, we won't take into the referral from new patient numbers into our calculations, but we're going to show some real basics to think through when you're engaged with a marketing agency, whether it's us or another environment, to think through the possibilities of the numbers and to get very clear on the opportunities, whether you're investing in your practice or looking at it as an expense. There's two very, very different ways to think about this. Remember, you're building a brand. It's not just a function of trying to relegate dollars into different pies for expenditures. It's about the long-term effects of a spend. So let's get right into it. And we're going to talk about basically some very simple ways to think through spends. We're going to look at really about 7 different titles here, but remember, think in your mind with your procedures and your particular practice on how this might have an impact. We're going to look at cost per acquisition, cost per lead, cost per click, average lifetime value, cost of goods sold, willingness of cost to acquire, your margin, and then refunds, fails, and cancels. Really the main elements. This is where you start to really understand what the investment is when you start to use spends, and that would be an ad spend for your marketing strategy. So let's first talk about the cost per acquisition, the top one here. So this is basically the most important informational piece of this entire podcast or video. This is what does it cost to acquire a new patient? Basically a patient sitting in a chair or sitting at a table to get them into your environment. Now, we usually see that once they're involved in the practice, they're pretty consistent. Now, we do understand there's always going to be some failure rate there, but really, in a lot of the practices where it's a cash-based practice or it's something of that nature, we have really a good cost per acquisition strategy. Cost per lead is the cost that it got to get the lead in. Cost per click is the cost per click for the ad. So let's do some simple math right here in this section and get through this. So if we look at, let's say, a $10 cost per click. Let's say you pay $10 for someone to click on an ad to come to your practice, or click on an ad to make a phone call, which is probably an easier way to think of it. So let's just say, in this particular case, it costs 5 clicks to make a phone call or a true appointment. And that's kind of what we see in the industry, right? So 5, 6 clicks, right around there, where that's the sort of number to average it out. So that costs $50 for that cost per lead. So that's someone coming in or calling you as an appointment. Inbound meaning a lead. So we find that that's about a 25% close rate on those leads. So that equals $200 per the cost per acquisition to put someone in a chair or into a table or into the waiting room for a cost per acquisition. So that's a very simple model. In fact, these numbers are very true for a lot of different practitioners because we find that that cost per click is $10. Now, we can always sharpen the sword or get sharper in time, which we call SIT, the cost per click, because that's all copywriting and that's what we do for a living. We build the ads so that they're efficient, and we can get this variable cost of $10 down and so forth, depending on the activity. So then we want to look at average lifetime value. So let's say the average lifetime value of a client's $5,000. That could be returning visits, it could be one-time procedure. There's all sorts of ways to try and put through the process of how you calculate an average lifetime value. But really, we're going to, in this case, look at $5,000. Cost of goods sold. All right, so in this case, we're going to use a margin number of 40%. So basically, of that $5,000, we look at $3,000 as the final number of what that produces. That includes all the things that you normally would do in a general counting strategy for a gross margin. And then we have willingness to have a cost to acquire. So let's think about this. Really, our willingness is to pay 10x the cost per acquisition, right? So if we look at that, we're really looking in the case of this particular scenario of $200, right? So that would be $2,000 of that $3,000 revenue up to $300. So we really have a little bit of a variable here. So we could go up to $300 to equal that amount of revenue. Of course, we want to stay, obviously, within the framework of profitability. So we want to stay under that $3,000. So we have up to $300 to spend for that lead, but we'd like to have it closer to $200. Of course, you can't get too low, or you kind of sacrifice some of the elements of this model. And then margin, again, that varies based on procedure. Again, we're looking at like 40% gross margin. We'd like to see that as the number, and that's typical. And then your refunds, your fails, and your cancels, again, 10 to 20%. And we sort of calculate that in, again, at the 20% would be really, really high, but again, just like 10% would be a normal. And again, that it would be 1,000 of the 3,000, so up to $100, and that's at the very top end at 20%. So really, that's where your variable here from the 200 to 300 pay per lead from a willingness to cost to acquire is evaluated. So really, this is a model you could look at. You could plug in your own numbers and do the math. And next time we come through, we'll actually use a real example. But this is a good way to kind of test some of the knowledge you have in your own practice when you start to invest in marketing and understand the numbers. Hope this helps. Matt Coffy, CEO of PracticeBloom.